Thank you for joining me today. I'm Madelyn Blair, and this is Unlocked, a show all about building the resilient leader in you. Have you ever worked on a team where you just couldn't seem to get a real discussion going about the challenges of the work because there was conflicting ideas about it? Today, we'll be addressing that challenge with real options so you can bring your teams up to the next level. Grounds for Thought will expand on the topic substantially, so stay tuned to see what's brewing. In May, Bruce Cryer talked about how we can align our breath and heart and bring coherence with our brains so that we can more easily think clearly. In June, my guest was Ariana Friedlander, who spoke on difficult conversations and conversational intelligence. My Grounds for Thought expanded the same conversation to civil discourse. So here we are at the end of July, and we will continue on this by adding the work of Dr. Katrina Pugh, who will provide us with a model for conversational interactions that can achieve immediate and enduring collaborative outcomes and more. Kate has always worked at the human elements of business, recognizing that a company is made up of people who must work together to achieve business objectives. It was one of the things that drew me to work with her at Columbia University, where I observed her keen attention to the students, treating them as individuals, not just registrants. Today, she works at the intersection between human social behavior and the environment. As BLEU director, Kate leads the BLEU Standard program, called BLEU, which includes the BLEU Standard Verification, Advisory Consulting, Education, and the BLEU Consulting and BLEU Solution Provider networks. Katrina's career has combined strategic planning, business management, and academia, with clients like the Asian Development Bank, Maine Aquaculture Hub, DFAT, United Nations, WTO, and WWF, and more. As a member of the Columbia University faculty since 2011, Kate researches and teaches about how networks and conversation impact our accountability, innovation, and sense of belonging. I particularly liked the inclusivity of belonging. It is one of the major factors in creating both resilient individuals and resilient organizations. Kate, welcome to Unlocked.
Why, thank you. It is great to be here, Madelyn.
Okay, are we ready to jump right into this wonderful topic?
Yes.
All right. I want to begin at the beginning. What drew you to focus on the human interaction of conversation? Very specifically in your work, your teaching, your research.
Oh, I think many of us have a professor in our lives or a teacher in our lives who had a profound impact on them. In my case, I was at MIT and I met William Isaacs. He was teaching a course about dialogue. And I said, I want to do that. At the time, I certainly wasn't living a dialogic life. I actually finished my studies and I worked for Bill for a number of years. And I said, I don't know what I'm going to do next, but it's going to have dialogue in it. And that's where I got introduced to it.
I'll be darned. Well, it's amazing when you hear stories like that says to me that when we as faculty, I'm now no longer in faculty, but you're still there, that that everything you do is impactful. Gives one a good feeling. All right, so you're now working in BLEU. Please tell the audience what is meant by BLEU.
Yes, indeed. So the BLEU standard, or nicknamed BLEU, as you suggested earlier, is a program under the umbrella of Oceanic Global. So Oceanic Global is a 501c3 global nonprofit organization that brings into harmony people and the oceans. And we do it through a number of different programs. So we do it through educational campaigns, we do it through global convenings, we do it through grants, we have community hubs. And my area is called the industry programs, and that's the BLEU standard. Inside the BLEU standard, we have a verification that organizations or products have gotten rid of their single-use plastics and that they've undertaken major sustainability efforts. So you might be an office that is no longer using plastic cups, and you've also decided that you're going to use solar energy or that you're going to have composting. So those kinds of things we verify with the BLEU standard. We also do advisory consulting. We do education, and we stand up networks for the organizations that are seeking to be BLEU. And if
Mm.
you get the standard, you can wear the BLEU seal. So if you go onto the site, bluestandard.com, you'll learn a lot about Oceanic Global and about BLEU.
All right. BlueStandard.com.
That's right.
I'm on it. I'm going to check it out. Our oceans are very important to our lives.
95% of our biosphere is the ocean.
Yeah.
And something like 10% of all of the carbon from fossil fuels has some interaction with plastics. Either it's in the production or in the incineration or the waste management of plastics. And it's just terrible to think about how much it's affecting our oceans, our human bodies, and the entire food chain. So we have an opportunity. Let's seize it. Let's get rid of plastics.
All right. Well, as you describe this, I am reminded of the complexity of this situation and of today's world. It's not that nature was ever simple before, but rather I think we're beginning to appreciate nature's complexity. It begins to tell me why you're working in this arena. What are some of the other factors that lead us rather to recognize the complex nature of any issue that we face today?
When we're in particular talking about something that you might describe as a social ecological system, you're saying that humans are interacting with each other. They're developing policy. They're every day deciding, are they going to take down a dam? Are they going to implement a policy? Are they going to change their recycling behavior? All of that kind of work requires humans have a greater contact with each other and with their natural environment. And this requires a fundamentally different attitude about conversation. And why I'm really drawn to this, having spent my time in academia thinking about conversation and dialogue, is that this is an incredibly important application of these kinds of skills. We have to interact across the supply chain. We have to interact with scientists and social media developers and artists and businesses. And by having all of that diversity, you need a different way of talking and being.
Well, speaking of a different way, you've always worked in knowledge. Well, I shouldn't say always. What I know of you, you've worked in knowledge management, where the underlying principle is about making it possible for people to share their knowledge with each other more easily. That's my simple way of describing it. Because it is the conversation with each other where knowledge is shared and even created, and it's certainly able to be put to good use, as you suggest. I think it'd be useful for you to kind of define what you mean by that conversation, dialogue, knowledge sharing, and why it's so critical.
So going back to the 1990s, when I was working with William Isaacs at Dialogos and at MIT, one of the first things he gave us was a unique definition of dialogue. Dia and logos means through and meaning, or the word. So meaning flowing through. This idea of motion, this idea of flow was central to our conceptualization of dialogue. And one of the things that has permeated my work since those early days when I was exposed to these ideas is this idea that we can change the conversation. Everybody talks about collaboration and they talk about large cooperations across countries or even, God forbid, in our future, across planets. But when I finally get down to it, it's in this interaction between humans. We're at that level of interaction where we can make fundamental changes, not only in the meaning that we co-create, but in ourselves. And those changes can be emotional, they can be physical. You know, I'm thinking about Ariana Friedlander and some of her work. She's been speaking as well about the heart. Yeah. In conversation, not only we come up with new ideas, we can do more innovating, we can even change our motivations, but we also can change ourselves biologically. I'll tell you more about that, but I want you to proceed.
Good. Well, I have to say one thing. I love it when people take a word and go back to the root of it, so you really get a sense of what it meant. And as you were talking about dialogue, through meaning, I was thinking, I've done a lot of work around conversation. In fact, I have a presentation on it that I love to give. And it really means to turn around with. Now, think about that in relationship to what dialogue means. It's just, it even conjures a beautiful image in my mind. Okay. So in your work, you add summarization and invitation. I think maybe you should describe a little bit about this 5DD that I hinted at the beginning.
Oh, you're wonderful. I love it. It's like eating dessert first. So for sure, when many people talk about dialogue as a practice, they're talking about emergence. They're talking about co-creation, but oftentimes they're not modernizing the construct to include things that we can do and are actually obligated to do in our modern business setting, in our modern world. And one of the things that we can do, thanks to our technology and thanks to our new habits, is reach out and invite others in or turn to them and acknowledge them. We have so many more vehicles for interacting. Just think about our various different phones and our various different, when we're coming in here, lo and behold, I had several different applications open, which were probably all interactive. So in addition to some of the standard practices of dialogue, an innovation that my team undertook while I was at Columbia and trying to use this with our students was this idea of reaching in and bringing in, what we call inclusion. The second thing we added was a summarization or an up-leveling, even an uplifting, which we call translation. So if you listen to me talk about the practices of conversation, what I call the 5 discussion disciplines, you'll see the fingerprints of dialogue, but you'll also see these 2 other things, which are about bringing people in and acknowledging them, making sure there's that deliberate interaction, and summarization. So the 5 discussion disciplines are integrity, which means making great statements, making clean statements, not snarky statements or sarcastic statements, but statements that speak with agency. The second is what we call integrity Q, which is asking genuine questions. Asking questions not with an expectation to pounce and respond, or not with an expectation that one has the answer, so that in fact they're not asking a question, they're making a statement disguised as a question. And then we have courtesy. Courtesy is about respecting others and respecting the forum, respecting the mores and norms of where you are, and giving people the birth to be themselves, giving them space. Mm-hmm. And then we have inclusion. And inclusion is what I mentioned. It's about acknowledging people, saying that they are seen, bringing them in to the extent that they need to be brought in.
Mm.
Finally, we have translation, which is up-leveling and summarizing. So what's interesting about these discussion disciplines is that they combine meaning with interaction, belonging, and interdependency. We found in the research, in fact, in my own research, I trained a generative AI application. We used at that time a predecessor to ChatGPT.
Mm-hmm.
We found that we were able to show that an increase in inclusion and an increase in courtesy translated into a 45% in a 10% increase in inclusion translated into a 45% increase in the likelihood of intent to act, and an increase in courtesy translated into a very large, like a 23% increase in the likelihood of intent to act. Now, other dependent variables are things like how much creativity is there, or how much belonging is there? Is there a deliberate evidence of people supporting each other more because these discussion disciplines are present? Our research didn't go there yet, but we were able to definitively say, hey, that inclusion thing really has these people sitting up and being self-aware, seeing that they have to claim their seats. And the way that the research worked was we trained this AI based on coded phrases that we had used in a sustainability context. And then we used this trained model and we ingested 23,000 utterances, which we then were able to go and use to create this regression. We used a binary logistic regression to come with those outcomes. And it's just been fascinating. Just so fascinating.
But I love the fact that you were right on the edge with using AI. And because processing, I mean, I've done sociological research in my stuff, and I know what it's like to look at thousands and thousands of pieces of information that you somehow have to put together. So I think that's so cool. And the fact that you actually observed, and I think it's a subtle thing that the when they exhibited those qualities that you talked about of feeling like you're a part of it and your courtesy and etc., that you actually then could see a further increase in commitment to follow up. I just think that's amazing.
So that is something that was starting to become evident already in the social ecological systems literature and also in the behavioral insights literature. So I love this idea of a dialogue between different disciplines as well as dialogues between different people. Yeah. And the psychological or the behavioral literature was starting to say when someone is being observed, they're more likely to follow through.
Yeah.
And we saw that inside of conversations over time. And the same is true when somebody is making some kind of commitment to be ecologically responsible, to reduce their consumption of energy. Erez Yoli, David Rand, and their teams did a piece of research on that, and they studied how people living in different apartments who wrote their names down when they declared they're going to reduce their energy consumption were more likely to actually follow through than when they didn't write their names down, but they said it orally. Yeah. So there was that very kind of clear declaration that resulted in statistically significant greater likelihood of them following through.
Cool. All right. So let's take this out of the theoretical and take it into a maybe not even a discussion about environment, maybe just a discussion about how are we going to solve this customer problem. And yet your team is they're just not listening to one another. So tell me how you bring these wonderful concepts into the workplace.
Well, I'll tell you a couple of watchwords for me that have been really helpful. One is flexibility. Just knowing that if you want to make a statement and you're noticing that have been lots of statements, be flexible. Maybe now is the time to inquire. Maybe now is the time to summarize. Maybe now is the time to just simply look someone in the eye and say, I hear you. I hear you.
Now,
So
you just said
yeah,
something which gave me some insight. Summarize. That has to do with your translation, right?
it does.
So you're listening to all the things that are being said, and then you might say something like, I think this is what I'm hearing right now. And then is that what you mean? Were you actually
Yes.
sharing with the group what you think? Yeah, okay.
Yes. Yes. So as a participant, you need to have flexibility. You have to be imagining the conversation, bringing these different discussion disciplines into balance.
Mm-hmm.
So it takes some initial time to start listening for them.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there's tone involved.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, you start realizing that there are subtle differences between, for example, a question and a statement disguised as a question, right? And you learn to listen for what's missing. And that's why flexibility is so important. You could end up with a logjam because you're seeing someone making a statement, and maybe they're even just asking questions and it's just going nowhere. Could be kind of a point counterpoint, or it could be just like a hall of mirrors. And you learn that as a member of the group or a facilitator, just be flexible. The second thing is to realize that a group will develop trust and it will take time, but they're only going to develop that trust and they're only going to be able to take the time together if they are reflecting on the content and the process. So the second thing that's so important is really that idea of trust building. So you need flexibility and you need trust building. And people will say, oh, isn't trust building just, kind of being nice and fulfilling your promises?
Mm-mm.
Trust building as it pertains to conversation is being willing to be transparent, being willing to talk about what was the dynamic that was going in there. What did you mean? Oh, really? Did you mean that? I thought you meant this. I felt accused and you were trying to just ask a question. Who knew? So the trust building is the second really important dimension to it. And the third really important dimension to it is to make sure that you give yourself applause. When people do unique things, be there for them. Hey, Kate, I imagined that you were sitting at the edge of your seat and you're going to jump in. And look at you. You asked a question. Not a question that was leading somewhere, but a question that showed you were curious. So celebrate it. Celebrate each other. So this combination of flexibility, trust building, and just celebration, those three things are essential to building these skills in the discussion disciplines.
And you know what? Those are easy things to do.
Well,
you have to remember to do them.
you have to be remembered to them. But if I were to simply say to you, kind of like nudge you in the side with my elbow, and I said, oh, how about some flexibility? You would probably say, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. Thanks for reminding me. Or if I looked you in the eye and I said, you done good, then you would probably agree. And you'd probably want to keep that kind of celebration going on in our next conversation.
That's right. That's right. Well, one of the things that I really love about your model is actually the second thing that you mentioned, that's integrity Q. The questions, which means that you should be curious about what has been said. Curiosity is such a powerful step to understanding. And if understood, it, it is never judgmental. That's the real question, is never judgmental. It really just means I need more information. I used to say that to my students all the time. I'm going to ask you 1,000 questions. Never think of this as something that's judgmental. I just need more information. We talk about this being non-judgmental in conversation, but I think the addition of asking questions really expands this to something that is truly valuable. Um, I think you've already talked about this, but feel free to expand on this.
That is so nice that you raised it. So you explained earlier that we were working together and that we were leading our students in these conversations. And if you remember, we were trying to figure out what were these discussion disciplines. Do you remember how we had one word, integrity, and we didn't have integrity and integrity Q? So what happened as I was starting to do that data work and I was coding all those conversations, I needed to decouple the integrity from the integrity Q. I needed to make a sense of the impact of making statements and the impact of asking questions. Now, of course, that's not novel. So we both remember reading Chris Argyris, who in the 90s started talking about this balance of advocacy and inquiry. But when we discussed the original model of the discussion disciplines, we had 4 discussion disciplines, and they mimicked in many ways the dialogue practices, which had one thing called voice. And it included the voice of asking questions as well as the voice of making statements. But when we started to realize we needed to really get intelligent about measuring and learning the discussion disciplines, we realized we had to have 5 discussion disciplines, not just 4. We needed integrity, and then we needed integrity Q. And it is really true that a high integrity question, which is one that's spoken out of true curiosity, has a remarkable effect. It can change everybody's perspective because sometimes the answer is, I've not been asked that question before.
That's right.
Wow, how do I know what I think until I see what I say, is what Carl Weick says.
Yeah, I understand that one. Well, it's one of the reasons why the questions from children are just so they're so illuminating. I mean, it doesn't matter that you know the answer to their question. The illuminating part is to watch in their eyes this vast, sudden interest in something of their universe that they're asking about. Yeah. Oh, I love that. Integrity Q. I think I'm going to talk about that more in my own work. I like that a lot. And of course, from the perspective of resilience, my area, people who are highly resilient tend to be insatiably curious. They just are. So.
They're insatiably curious, and in many cases, they're more likely to interact with another human from the posture of curiosity.
Yeah.
And somebody who's particularly resilient is not going to hurt themselves by carrying resentments. They're the ones that are going to be able to sort of say, oh, I wonder if that person cut me off over in that intersection because, they had a puppy that needed to go to the puppy run, right? Or maybe they couldn't see me. Or maybe they cut me off because there was something wrong with their visibility or something. We'll never know, but I'm a happier person, a more resilient person to the extent that I've been curious as opposed to accusative.
Accusative, right. Now, I know you have this beautiful model. Where have you applied it, and can you tell us about one of the examples so we can see it in action, so to speak?
Well, I've used it in a number of different places. Many times I've done it with students. And in the context where students, mostly adults, who, they're working professionals who are working on teams, in many cases, teams where there is ambiguity around the power structure, they find as one of their biggest touchstones the ability to use the 5 discussion disciplines. It gives them a common vocabulary. It gives them a bit of evidence about their mutual respect. It gives them new language for asking questions without being shaming or shamed. And that has proven to be invaluable. Many times my students have gotten to a certain point in their program and they've said, light bulb just went off. Now I understand why you've taken the time to teach us about multiple scales of collaboration, but this scale is so essential to their learning and their well-being and the productivity of their teams back at their professional organization. So that's one area. Another area that's really worth looking at is when you're working on a project team, and I've seen this in many, many of my clients, and they know they need to be collectively resilient. They know they need to have the apparatus to handle things that come to them from the outside. And it could be the software that they purchased is not actually working the way they thought it was. They have to configure something more and they're going to go over budget. Or they realize that their customers are asking for a different scope than originally planned. Or there's a restructuring that's taking place. Many times I've been inside of restructurings. And to the extent that I can sort of inhabit the 5 discussion disciplines, I'm a better support to the person who's joining me from another organization with a different culture. And also, I'm a better support to my peers as they're processing whatever kind of restructuring that's going on, whether it's a merger or changes of responsibilities of different divisions.
That's so important because in those kinds of situations, there's a great deal of emotion. An emotion is valid, but it also can get in the way of thinking clearly.
Yes, and it's not as if emotion goes away. One of the beauties of working with a group and having the discussion disciplines is that you're suddenly now giving yourself, with that trust building, permission to say, do you know what I just said? That was super emotional. I care about you. And I didn't say it in that manner to hurt you. I said it in that manner because my anxiety was high while I was saying it. I was particularly anxious. And it was not intended to reflect you. It was intended to reflect me. And it could have been, by the way, it could have been, your form of inclusion. It could have been your translation. It could have been your integrity cue. It just happened that you did it laden with, pitch or with cadence that was too fast. So we learned to be able to show our appreciation for each other's emotions. And perhaps in some respects, we learn to be able to name our own emotions to the extent that we've built that trust and that flexibility and reasons for celebration.
Yeah. Oh, let's come back to that celebration. I think that's just a terrific addition to all this. I often have had clients who resisted the idea that we should celebrate something. I mean, this is just work. Talk more about that.
Well, so we're always trying to meet deadlines, come up with new ideas on a shoestring. We're always trying to see if we can be more creative, but perhaps with fewer funds, or we're trying to become more visible or more influential. There's so much competition and so much hyperbole in a lot of the work that we're in, and things are moving more quickly. But by keeping the discussion disciplines as the if you will, the apparatus for interactions with each other, all of that could bring us to our worst selves. We could find the shadows of every single one of these. We could find a snarky statement, or we could
Mm-hmm.
find
Mm-hmm.
a sarcastic thing. But when we're using the discussion disciplines, despite all of that stuff coming at us, and we celebrate it, it snowballs. It snowballs. It means that we're that much more ready to use them the next time there is stress, the next time we need to care for each other instead of accuse each other. And that's worthy of celebration. Every single time we use these, particularly under situations where they're not the most convenient, that's when we have to celebrate.
I like that a lot. And you're right. It's at the time that it's the least convenient is when it's probably the most important. Yeah.
It's
Excellent.
true.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to talk about in terms of the 5D?
Yeah, I'll
You
have
haven't
a,
talked about translation for much so far.
well, I'll talk a little bit about translation, and then I'll talk a little bit about sort of various different ways to help learn it. And you can do that informally and formally. And I said, you're building trust by trying it out, but I didn't say how to do it. So let's talk about translation first.
Okay.
So I mentioned that translation wasn't native to the dialogue practices. When we were in circles, looking at each other and bringing out concepts and ideas, we were discouraged from translating. In fact, the dialogue would kind of hang in the air, almost like a musical cadence that hadn't been resolved. And you sat there and you were like, yes, and what about that conclusion? And so, as I mentioned, we modified the original dialogue practices to include this idea of up-leveling, summarizing. But it's perilous, I might add, because I might summarize hastily based on my needs. So I might say, I had this great conversation with Madelyn. Oh, it was good because we talked about integrity Q. We talked a little bit about inclusion. Oh, yeah, and we talked about translation. And I might write that down and send that in a text. But what you might have wanted me to say, or if we were together and we were sending a text together to our boss to say, aren't we cool? You would have preferred that I summarized as well the care with which you prepared the interview, the understanding that you showed, that you had clever comebacks that were so well articulated, not only because you're good at that, but because we have history together. Mm-hmm. And that means that translation has to be done with quite a bit of humility. So we need to be able to say, it's as good as I can with this kind of orientation. The second thing about translation that is positive, I mean, it's positive too to have humility, but the positive thing about translation is that it welcomes in others to the extent that you can say, oh, we were talking about this and it went here. The other person comes in and says, oh, well, thank you for inviting me to be part of it. I don't feel that I have to wait and absorb, or I don't feel that I'm peripheral. I'm here because people want me to be here. And you've been in a cocktail party where you step into a little group and you're kind of feeling a little icky because you're interrupting something. And somebody turns to you, they open their shoulder and they say, it's so lovely to see you, Madelyn. We were just talking about what it means to be unlocked. Or we were just talking about what it means to live in Maryland. Or we were just talking about what it means to have grandchildren, whatever. Regardless, you now feel that you've been welcomed because that translation propelled it forward.
Beautiful example. Thank you for that. I'm going to keep that in mind and observe, because there certainly have been times when I felt exactly as you said. Should I step into this group? I've never met some of these people before. You think about that.
Exactly. And you'll notice that we're sort of stepping into how do people learn how to do this. One of the nicest ways of learning how to do this is with examples. So I have often invited people to just huddle and just spend time talking about Integrity Q. Just like, let's talk about Integrity Q. Let's talk about all these times that we were inquiring and we weren't really inquiring. And by the way, no one's going to tell anybody, this is a cone of silence. Or let's just talk and let's just meditate on what courtesy looks like. Courtesy for you in this context might not be courtesy for me in that same context. So let's talk about what courtesy is and what do you need for courtesy from me. The second thing I do is I invite some people to be a little bit more transparent, or not transparent as in like truthful, but transparent as in like clear, invisible, and have them be what we call social reporters. So in particular, when I'm teaching my students about this, they're doing it in online discussions. And I invite them to take turns being what we call a social reporter. And they might just hold a mirror to their peers and saying, oh, well, that was a great example of integrity.
Gotcha.
So you get benefits by talking about or working through examples and really nice stories. And you also get benefits and learning opportunities by doing this thing called social reporting, by doing this thing which is called sort of observing others and observing the patterns. So those are two really important learning strategies.
That last one, I really like the idea of, especially if it's a team where you have a semi-stable stable group. Today, Sally, I want you to be the observer. And
Social reporter. Yep.
the social reporter. Yeah. And you're right. Everyone is learning, but that person learns at a different level, a higher level, because they have to observe, judge, note. Nice. Very nice. Did we cover all the pieces you wanted to cover?
We did cover a lot of them. One that I think would be particularly helpful is as people are learning as a team. So we talked a lot about, individually building skills, and we talked about trust building. And of course, we've talked about celebration. But another way that I've found to be really helpful for learning is literally taking a transcript. So when I did my research, we were not recording these transcripts. So I had to have very, very strong transcription skills, manual transcription skills, and coding skills. Now a lot more of that is available to us with things like Fireflies and Otter and other types of voice-to-text transcriptions. I encourage teams, individuals and teams, to just go and take the transcription. Don't take the summary. The summary is great for its own purposes, but go and look at it and just throw it into a spreadsheet. Give them labels and then just count. Does this particular conversation have a preponderance of courtesy? Are people all being too nice? Or maybe they should be nice. Or is there inadequate translation? Do we really have such a small amount of translation relative to what we would have expected, considering that this is a meeting about a plan?
Yeah.
That is a very, very helpful thing. And it doesn't take as much time as you think. Like, you don't have to take the entire transcription. As you guys all know, it can be 300 lines. Just take 100 of them. Take the first 100, or take the middle 100. Just look at them and just sort of see, what am I seeing?
Yeah.
And my own experience is that many of those lines might be composites, and that's just fine. Just break them up and say, okay, so I've got a question, Integrity Q, followed by courtesy. You might say something like, did you finish? Which is a question. I like that you're listening to me, which is basically the courtesy.
Yeah. Ah, wow. Speaking of finished, we are just about out of time, but I have to read the final sentence from your paper because it is dynamite. You said, we must all learn to practice conversation as an act of sense making, and generosity to recapture the traditional wisdom of community and to reimagine life-giving interactions. Well said and well done, Kate.
Why,
Thank
thank you.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful, exciting conversation.
I've enjoyed it very, very much. And it's been particularly nice to talk about it with you. I'm
Oh.
sure you remember you have your fingerprints on this whole model.
Well, thank you for that. Every now and then, there is something that changes how I think about the world. Grounds for Thought is a place where I talk about these moments so that you can explore the meaning for yourself. Peter Block has written many books, but my favorite one is called Community, the Structure of Belonging. His approach to this subject is insightful and clear. And you'll also hear some familiar things that Kate has just talked about. My intention here is to talk about what struck me as I read it. Let's begin with what he talks about using the word conversation. Peter Block says, quote, I am using the word conversation in a broad sense, namely all the ways that we listen, speak, and communicate meaning to each other. So in addition to speaking and listening, this meaning of conversation includes the architecture of our buildings and public spaces, the way we inhabit and arrange a room when we come together, and the space we give to the arts. Now, when I read that sentence, it immediately brought to mind another one of my very favorite books that I talk about a lot in Grounds for Thought, called 50 Lessons to Learn from Frank Lloyd Wright. There are lessons like break the box, learn from indigenous design, make the room dance, build with the land and not on it, dwell in the living room, express the room within, screen doesn't close, form a room with furniture. As I write these, I am struck again by Wright's amazing understanding that his buildings were for people to use, just as Peter Block's community is about building relationships. Block talks about how we tend to see community as a problem to be solved. This construction has value, he says. It values implementation, doing, tangible results. With this set of values, there is no power to bring something new into being. Thinking of the community as a problem to be solved limits our thinking to what exists and how it can be controlled. But when he talks about communities, our human systems give form by conversations that build relatedness, suddenly you see that community, to him, is about creating something new through the interaction of individuals, not confined to a problem, but rather focused on possibilities. I'll summarize this by describing a meeting that Peter was facilitating. The first thing he did was he had us rearrange all the chairs into small circles, 4 to 6 people. Small enough, he would always say, that everyone in the circle could touch each other's knees. He said that we had to be that close to really have the opportunity to create something new as we built the relationships among us. All I can say is, it worked. And so I want to return to his definition of conversation. He says, I am using the word conversation in a broad sense, namely all the ways that we listen, speak, and communicate meaning to each other. So in addition to speaking and listening, this meaning of conversation includes the architecture of our buildings and public spaces, the way we inhabit and arrange the room when we come together, and the space we give to the arts. Now look again at Wright's lessons from architecture. In particular, dwell in the living room. Express the room within. Screens don't close. Form the room with furniture. I hope you're beginning to see, as I have, that conversation is a place where we can set the intention from our hearts, the rules from our minds, and the space for our bodies, where together we can create new worlds of possibilities. Community, the Structure of Belonging by Peter Block. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I hope you've enjoyed the conversation and learned something new. And if you have a question you'd like to explore with me, go to my website, madelynblair.com, and schedule a free consultation. And by all means, if you're on YouTube, click that like button and, of course, subscribe. Because you know what that really does is it helps people, excuse me, it helps people find what they're looking for. I'm Madelyn Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilient leader.